Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our offshore wind information sessions with Net Zero Atlantic and the Cape Breton Partnership. We're going to walk through a presentation. Feel free to ask questions throughout. You can just stop us and raise your hand. This looks very formal, but we'd like for it to be informal and more of a dialogue conversation. So the Cape Breton Partnership is an economic development organization. We focus on all sectors across Cape Breton. We do economic support for the four of the First Nations and all 5 of the municipalities. We do that through the Regional Enterprise Network, which is in partnership with the province of Nova Scotia. We do work in immigration, we do welcome networks for newcomers to the island, entrepreneur support, business support, a very wide array of activities through the partnership. And my role, sorry I didn't even say my name is Jennifer McNeil, and I'm the Green Energy Engagement Coordinator for the Cape Breton Partnership. This program is really focused on two-way knowledge sharing, so we want to have dialogues with communities and develop relationships with rights holders and stakeholders so that we can become a trusted source of information for communities, and so that communities are prepared to make decisions about any development that could happen in the future. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. So my name is Victoria Watson. I work for Net Zero Atlantic, and we are collaborating with the partnership on these sessions. So Net Zero Atlantic is a not-for-profit organization. Our main office is based in Halifax, but we have staff all over Atlantic Canada and some outside of the region as well. And our work focuses on supporting the transition to net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050, which is a national target that we'll actually talk a little bit about later. And that is essentially getting us to net zero emissions by that timeline. Our work focuses specifically on addressing gaps in the knowledge of how we're going to get there. Specifically in Atlantic Canada that we're facing in the energy transition. So that brings us to the topic of offshore wind. We are not pro-offshore wind, same with the partnership. We are just talking about it as an option that might help us get to net zero, to that target. But we're not here to convince you about offshore wind or try to tell you why we should adopt it here in Nova Scotia. We really just want to share knowledge and information about it. And specifically the project that I'm representing is capacity building for the sustainable and inclusive development of Nova Scotia's offshore wind resource. It's quite a mouthful, but this project is funded by Natural Resources Canada, and they basically asked us to do this project and go out to communities and across Nova Scotia and build a baseline of knowledge on offshore wind so that people can kind of start to think about it, that it's coming, wonder about the technology, how it might impact local communities, and we'll help and do our best to answer questions, talk about concerns, bring that information back to our funders as well as other stakeholders like the provincial government, developers, regulators, and so on. But again, that two-way knowledge sharing piece is really important. So not just us bringing information to communities, but also learning from the communities what are the specific concerns and contexts for each place that we visit. So today we're going to discuss why we need more renewable energy. We're going to discuss an introduction to offshore wind as a technology and as a resource. We'll also discuss the regulations that are in development currently, and we'll discuss opportunities to get involved. So why do we need more renewable energy? So what was formerly sort of referred to as global warming has sort of been rebranded to climate change in the last little while. And the reason for that is because even though warming is an impact that we are expected to see, there is a lot more than that happens with this greenhouse effect that's causing climate change. So essentially what happens is that human activity releases emissions into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and those molecules get trapped in the atmosphere and then they trap heat that comes from the sun. So they're causing a warming effect, but then as well, that's also causing other changes in patterns, such as increased storm severity and frequency, increased precipitation, also increased dryness in certain areas. So a lot of changes that we might see include forest fires, for example, increasing. Looking at 2023 alone, we saw a lot of things happening that weren't normal. So something that we might expect to see more of are those things that we don't really want. So looking forward to think about what do we do to mitigate that. Something that we can do is reduce our emissions as much as possible. It's easier said than done because our whole energy system basically has emissions and we rely on that to do the things that we do. So when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions in Nova Scotia, our emissions have decreased a little bit since 2005. So if we look at this data that goes to, I think, 2022 or 2021, this was the peak in 2005, and it's since decreased a bit. So we're working on it, but to get to that net zero target by 2050, we still have a long way to go. And our emissions come from lots of different places. So we know that electricity in Nova Scotia, that's sort of what people think of when they think of where our emissions come from, driving our cars as well. So electricity and transportation make up most of our emissions in Nova Scotia. We have 41% of our emissions coming from electricity and 32% coming from transportation. Other categories include heat for buildings, industry, waste, and agriculture. So these are all different areas that we need to decarbonize or figure out how to reduce our emissions. And some areas are easier to do than others. For example, agriculture is kind of a tough one to decarbonize, where electricity, there tends to be more options. And that's sort of what we'll focus on today when we talk about offshore wind. So in Nova Scotia, as of 2022, 67% of our electricity was generated using fossil fuels. So that includes coal and natural gas, and I think it was over 40% of that 67% came from coal alone. So our province does still depend highly on coal for producing electricity, more than a lot of other provinces and a lot of other places in the world. The remaining percent, the 33% that came from renewable energies, such as solar, wind, and hydro, those are nice because they have less greenhouse gas emissions. They're also a continuously replenished resource, so we don't have to worry about them running out like we do with things like oil and gas. And Jen's going to talk about offshore wind technology.
Did anybody have any questions on the renewable energy and our targets?
I don't have a question, but I'll add something actually. So can you actually go back? I forgot to mention this. So I mentioned the 2050 target of getting to net zero. So that's Canada-wide, but also in Nova Scotia, we've adopted that target as well. In addition to that, in Nova Scotia, we have a target to achieve 80% of our electricity generated by renewables by 2030. So that also, at the same time, we have the target to come off of coal completely, remove coal from our electricity system by 2030. So if we think about where we're currently at, or the most recent data from 2022, where we have 67% of our emissions, or sorry, of our electricity generated with fossil fuels, we have to get that up to 80, or get that down to 20% or less by 2030, and then bring renewables from 33% up to 80% in the next 6 less years.
Yeah. I'm just going to give a fairly basic overview of the offshore wind technology that exists today. So when we're thinking of the end use of offshore wind, we're considering grid connection, where it would be connected to our current transmission system, and it could be used domestically or exported as well. And then the other use that's getting a lot of attention, or we're hearing a lot about, is green fuels production. So that would be hydrogen, ammonia, ethanol. And this process to produce hydrogen, you have to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen, and it's incredibly energy intensive. So that this is what makes the offshore wind attractive, because of the capacity. And then to export it as green hydrogen, which you've seen with companies that have signed agreements with the EU, in order to be green energy, it has to be produced with renewable energy. This is just a simple overview of the components of a wind turbine. You have the hub, which supports the blades, and the pitch system, which controls the output. The blades capture the mechanical energy, so all that mechanical energy is being developed as the blades turn. The nacelle is what houses all of the components, both emergency brakes as well as the components that convert that mechanical energy into electricity. You're seeing the tower, very similar to what it looks like onshore, but we will get into some different types of turbines in a slide or two. And you'll see down here, or up in this little circle, it's a little bit fuzzy, but one spin of a turbine, depending on the output, can power an average household for more than 2 days. When we're looking at onshore versus offshore wind, which is something that we talk about a lot, onshore wind turbines are quite a bit smaller. This graph is actually new but already dated because research and development is happening quickly. So we've seen onshore turbines of 12 megawatts that are being developed now. They're actually in use in China. So we're kind of past the 2035 point for this. Offshore wind turbines, we haven't reached the 17 megawatt yet. We've reached research and testing for around 14 to 15 megawatts. Obviously, the larger the turbine, the more energy it's producing. There's also more consistent winds offshore as well, which Victoria will talk about shortly. And so that structure has to hold up to that as well. And then the other issue is spacing. So the rotor diameters are a lot larger for the larger turbines that are offshore. You're seeing 250 meter estimation of a wingspan for a span, not a wingspan, for a capacity of 17 megawatts. And these are the two types of turbines that exist. We have fixed bottom, and each turbine can only be used in specific instances. So it requires a specific seabed geology as well as water depths. So when you're looking at fixed bottom, these are the ones that are pile driven into the seabed. You're looking at between 0 and 60 meters of water depth. This is the most common form of technology. It's been around for a long time. They've been using it for approximately 30 years in Europe. It is the most cost effective. It's reached that scale, or economies of scale. Floating, however, is a newer technology. There's no commercial sites that exist yet. For floating to be possible, it can be more than 60 meters, which obviously there's a lot of ocean space that's about more than 60 meters. There's different forms. They have mooring cables that attach to the seabed, and that's what keeps the structure in place. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
So this technology here, again, is still in research and development. We're seeing there's a couple of projects. There's one off of the south of France, and there's also one off the coast of Scotland. They're very much in a demonstration phase. They're not producing power at a large scale. There is a project set to go online off of Norway that will produce 88 megawatts.
Thank you.
Was there any questions? Questions? Yeah?
What's the key benefit comparing the floating versus the anchored? Or is there any at all?
They're cheaper for the monopiles, so that's the key benefit there. That's the most attractive because it is the cheapest form of energy to produce. The floating, the technology hasn't reached scale yet, so it is quite a bit more expensive, and not launched widely too, so not studied as much as the monopiles have been.
There are less restrictions around where you can put floating, mainly for the reasons that Jen covered, depth, as well as the seabed geology isn't as important there. So there's more flexibility on where you can put floating winds, so that means that there's more opportunities for where it can be put and ways that it won't cause impacts on other ocean users potentially, so more options. But yeah, generally, currently the cost is the biggest barrier to using more floating currently. But as we'll discuss a little bit later, by the time us in Nova Scotia could potentially have offshore wind, floating is expected to come down in price and be more comparable. So that might not be as big of a concern for us by the time they're looking at developing. But yeah, this next slide does often bring up a lot of questions, so we'll see. Something that we like to discuss when we're bringing up this topic is the current scale of offshore wind in other areas around the world. So we know that there's offshore wind installed in quite a few places, mainly off the shore or off the coast of Europe right now, as well as China. But an example of what's currently, I think it's still the largest operating offshore wind park in the world, is Hornsea 2. That's the name of the park. Not really sure where the name comes from, actually, if it's other than just the location.
It could be a language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's off the coast of the North Sea. So this is the UK, and we're sort of zoomed in here into this little square. So that's the area that we're looking at. So this is the farm that I'm discussing. This shaded area here is specifically the project, this Hornsea 2 project. That's the largest operating one currently. So it's hard to see, but it says P2 just for Project 2 out of the Hornsea series. P1 was a project that came online, I think, in 2019, so a few years before, and has a slightly lower capacity, but still quite a large project. And then P3 over here is currently being developed. But this Hornsea 2 project can generate enough green electricity to power over 1.4 million homes. It has a combined capacity of 1.32 gigawatts. So that consists of 165 offshore wind turbines. Each of those turbines has a capacity of 8 megawatts. And that project is 189 kilometers off the coast. So that would be equivalent to a project here in Nova Scotia being around the Sable Island area, the Sable Bank. And it takes up a total area of 462 square kilometers. So when we think about the numbers here, something that's pretty interesting is to kind of compare if we were to have that project here in Nova Scotia, hypothetically, 1.4 million homes. That's a lot of electricity that could potentially power all of homes in Nova Scotia. That capacity, 1.32 gigawatts, our generating capacity in Nova Scotia, for Nova Scotia Power's generating capacity is between 2 and 3 gigawatts currently. So that is a pretty significant portion of what our entire province can generate. And that 462 square kilometers, our entire offshore area that's currently being considered for offshore wind development by the regional assessment is a total of 300,000 square kilometers. So 462 square kilometers to produce 1.32 gigawatts. And in Nova Scotia, we have a target that was set by the provincial government in 2022 to lease seabed for 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So in 2025, next year, there's set to be a call for bids for these leases as long as all the regulations are set up in time. So this would basically enable developers to come and say they want to build here, put a bid on it, and then they'd be granted a license to develop. And then they would have then they would from there be able to do their environmental impact assessments and so on for that project and then be able to develop. But the target is for 5 gigawatts, not to have 5 gigawatts of offshore wind developed by 2030, but 5 gigawatts worth of seabed leased by 2030. Are there any questions about this, whether it's about this project specifically, if I have an answer to it, or anything related to any of these statistics or potentially what this could look like in Nova Scotia? These are me, right? So why Nova Scotia? So we know that it's really windy here. They always say it's the wind that gets you, so we might as well see what we can do with that wind. So if we look at this global map, it is kind of hard to see with the lighting currently, but this global map is looking at the wind resource onshore as well as offshore. Obviously, these sort of very offshore areas are not, there's no data for those on this map. But what we can see is that where Nova Scotia is, the offshore area is darker than the onshore area, so that matches here with this wind speed profile. We have the darkest purplish color is representing 10 meters per second or higher wind speeds. So our offshore area has 10 meters per second or higher, which is compared to our onshore area, which is more around this range, so about 5 to 6 or 7 meters per second. Our wind speeds are pretty much as good as they get. They're very comparable to areas that already have offshore wind developed. When we look at this figure over here that shows us the total installations offshore, this is as of the end of 2022, so this data is from last year, that tells us the total installations out of 64.3 gigawatts installed globally. A lot of that comes from Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK, who have all been a part of this offshore wind industry for a long time. China came into the industry more recently, but they have almost half of the total installations because they really sped up their industry pretty quickly. Also, something interesting to mention is that Canada is the only G7 country that currently doesn't have an existing offshore wind industry. So when we look at Nova Scotia with a bit more detail, if we zoom in, we can see here, this is a bit easier to see this scale. So again, onshore wind speeds are slower, we know that, and the offshore area does vary a little bit. So the highest speeds are down here, a little bit further from shore over here, and then this is all higher than 10 meters per second, coming up towards the strait as well, or on the other side of PEI. Our offshore wind resource, again, is considered world-class. It's exceptional, and those wind speeds offshore are higher and more consistent than onshore, which is why we're not just putting more onshore wind turbines up around the province, because there is more potential offshore than there is onshore. Another thing to consider is the water depth as well. So earlier, Jen showed us the different types of turbines. We have fixed and floating, and fixed turbines that are fixed to the seafloor are limited in depth of up to 60 meters. So the areas offshore Nova Scotia that are 0 to 60 meters include the Sable Island Bank, Middle Bank, as well as the near shore areas over here, and then some other areas, as you can see by the light blue color. Anywhere deeper than that, so 60 meters or deeper, is technically an opportunity for floating wind. So that's why there's floating sort of does have not an advantage, but there is that's sort of an opportunity that exists a lot more because of that floating option. So we have a lot of area that could be potential for floating. Some of these areas are suitable for fixed bottom, those 0 to 60 meters depth, as I mentioned. So that will actually correlate with this map. So if we look here at the areas that are shallower, and we look at this map, the areas that are in green, that's telling us that the areas that are considered to be lowest cost for offshore wind development, according to this study, which came out early last year, are potentially the lowest cost for offshore wind development, are the shallowest areas. So Sable Bank could potentially be a good area for offshore wind development because it's shallow, has sandy substrates, very conducive to offshore wind turbines, as well as Middle Bank. And then the near shore area is also, because it's shallow and close to shore, really good for offshore wind development in terms of cost alone. So the green areas in this map are considered to be cost competitive based on high wind speeds, the water depth, and the distance to ports and grid connection. So while Sable Bank is not necessarily close to shore, it is within a similar distance as that project I showed a few slides ago, Hornsea 2. It's also in an area where there's existing oil and gas projects. So there's current existing infrastructure that could be potentially used or repurposed for offshore wind industry. So this map is where things start to get a bit overwhelming. So on the previous map, we were only looking at cost, but we know that when we're actually going to be considering offshore wind development, and I keep saying we, but we're not the ones developing, of course, so we have nothing to do with it, but except for bringing the community knowledge to those people. But this map is an example of how we can consider multiple things and sort of put them together to help us decide where offshore wind could go. So on this map, we see that we're looking at catch per weight. The colors are really hard to differentiate with this lighting, but we have catch per weight for lobster fishing. You see a lot of that around this part of the province, as well as over here and up here. We also have fishing intensity. So the darker orange is increasing intensity for fishing. So we see a lot of that sort of scattered all over, really, down here as well. And then we have protected areas, so that's marine protected areas, refuges, and species at risk critical habitats are sort of marked around here. And that data is overlaid the previous map that's just looking at cost. So this is an example of a map that overlaid a couple of different constraints. However, this study selected a few sites that are suitable for offshore wind development based on low cost as well as these other constraints that they mapped. it's quite limited because that doesn't take everything into consideration. There was no community engagement done for this study, and there are other things missing. So some other things that need to be considered include fishing grounds, marine protected areas, seabirds, marine wildlife habitats, and shipping routes, to name a few. There's going to be a lot more as well that we'll get into, but this is not a study that said this is where development will go, and that's just what's going to be decided on. This is strictly just an example of how you can overlay different data sets and constraints to kind of help you figure that out, but this is not conclusive by any means. Are there any questions about this?
I'll talk a little bit about governing a new industry, which is the very exciting policy part of the presentation. I shouldn't be so facetious, but before getting into this, there are no projects. There's no projects planned, there's no projects that exist. We are still building the legislation and the regulatory framework in Nova Scotia in order to be able to get to that point. So sometimes there's a bit of confusion about whether or not projects are already happening, or we talk about the 5 gigawatts as a project more broadly. That's not the case. These are targets, and legislation and regulations have to happen first. The first area that's being focused on are the jointly managed waters between the federal and the provincial governments. These are areas that are governed under the Accord Act, which was developed, I think, in the 1980s, primarily for the regulation of oil and gas, creation of the offshore petroleum boards in the early 90s. And so the regional assessment is studying the area that's under that jurisdiction, which is this green area that you can see on the map. We've heard in the media that Nova Scotia was considering development towards the shore, like closer nearshore development. That has been paused. They are focused on the outcomes of the regional assessment. So once that process is over, then the province will make decisions from there based on those findings and other information, obviously. The regional assessment of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia, we all call it the RA for short. It's led by an independent committee appointed by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, so federally. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada is also involved in the process indirectly. As I said, Jim is a committee member. There are 5 committee members in total that are undergoing this process. The purpose is to inform and improve future planning, licensing, and impact assessment processes, to protect the environment, health, social, and economic conditions while creating opportunities for sustainable development. And in this process, it's really about data collection, information collection, and they are seeking information from fisheries, Indigenous communities, and leaders, the scientific community, as well as the general public. Anybody who has information that is, everybody's information is of value, but value to this process, and can contribute to it. There are lots of ways to do that, which we'll get into a little bit further down the line. The impact assessment, the Regional Assessment Committee will recommend geographic areas to be considered for future development and then provide recommendations to the government for how to mitigate and monitor any future projects using the baseline data that they've collected through this process. They are releasing in March a preliminary report which will contain georeference data for some sites. There was concern in previous instances that it's really difficult for people to make comments about spaces in the ocean when you don't have the specific space in the ocean. It's much different than land. And so that will be released along with some baseline data connected to some of the factors that I'll show you on the next slide. And the regional assessment is considering impacts both from a positive and an adverse impact. Adverse impacts would have to be mitigated. They will look at fisheries and other ocean uses, the economy, presumably jobs, economic development, benefits locally. The environment, they're looking at air quality and greenhouse gases. One of the bigger or most significant pieces is the marine fish and fish habitats, along with the other types of species like migratory birds and sea turtles. Fisheries is a focus. Lots of engagement happening with fisheries groups, and they have, you have expert opinion, words have left. Advisory committees for fisheries, indigenous communities, and the scientific community that you consult with regularly throughout this process. When we look at, will also be acoustic environmental concerns, particularly related to marine mammals and sea turtles. From a social perspective, there is a significant influence, in the vein of reconciliation, all processes should take extensive consideration of Indigenous concerns, activities, and rights into the development. Visual aesthetics, so that's the view planes. Can we see them from land? And if so, what impact does that have? Communities would be what's happening to these communities on a local level. Physical and cultural heritage, I'm a nerd and think it's cool because it's about shipwrecks and other things that are underwater. And then protected and special areas are the marine protected areas where you're seeing species at risk or endangered species that are in that area. So there's 3 processes happening, probably more, but we'll talk about 3 today. The offshore renewable energy regulations are being developed by Natural Resources Canada. So that will apply to the offshore renewable energy projects that are outside of these jointly managed areas, and they look at safety and environmental protection that's related to all phases of development. So from site selection through to construction, operation, and decommissioning, that will be in these regulatory framework. And then the implementation is happening with the Nova Scotia. Should the amendments to the Accord Act be passed, it's in front of, has it gone to? It's just still at the standing committee? There's a standing committee on natural resources that's taking witness testimony on the contents of the Accord Act and amendments that the experts would suggest for that before it goes back to the House for a 3rd reading. So that process is happening. Should that be passed, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board would then become the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Energy Regulator, and they would be responsible for all marine renewable energy that's regulated in these jointly managed waters. And provincially, we've seen the roadmap that was released. This is where it was stated a bit about nearshore development, but it's an evergreen document, and they're looking at lines of sight for industry as well as infrastructure and supply chain, and they're also doing engagement as well. The last part of the presentation is just looking at how you can stay involved in these processes that are happening. From the perspective of the regional assessment, there will be future open houses that will be planned in the springtime. You can also make written submissions, so if you have feedback, you can make it via the regional assessment email, which is here, or you can do it on the public registry. If you do it via email, does it end up on the public registry no matter what?
I'm not sure.
Okay. You can also give feedback to us, and we can pass the feedback along to the Regional Assessment Committee as well. There's a survey online. It's at the bottom here, and that is asking concerns. It's an introductory survey to find out what people know and what their concerns are, essentially. These slides are on our website, so you don't have to frantically put those numbers and letters in. If you scan the QR code at the back of the room on the poster board, you can get to our website. Our website has, as the Cape Breton Partnership, has all of these resources. We can connect you with the regional assessment, Net Zero Atlantic. The report that Victoria mentioned earlier is accessible through the website. And then from our perspective, we'll be back out in the communities doing workshops and keeping on top of that up-to-date information and synthesizing it and making it accessible to everyone across Cape Breton, because the information there's a lot of information and it's changing often. And so acting as that kind of trusted source is what we would hope to hope to gain. Thank you all for coming. It was great to see such a good turnout for our first session in CBRM.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.